mentioned a couple weeks ago that the book of Ruth was a work of protest, a writing of protest, like the book of Job, where Job was written in protest of the dominant moralism of the Deuteronomic perspective on things that saw good things happening to good people and bad things happening to bad people in a kind of quid pro quo manner. Job said it's much more complicated than that. And Ruth is a protest against exclusivity, against a growing racism, really, within the Jewish tradition. When the Persian king Cyrus allowed the Jewish people to return from their exile in Babylon back to Jerusalem and its environs, the first thing they did was to rebuild and purify the temple. That had been the center of their being, really, as a people in Judea and Samaria, and was of prime importance to the community as a focal point. But they also did some other things. They expelled, for example, the foreign wives, all the wives who had been married during the exile, who were not Jewish, were divorced and exiled from the Judea. And then when the governor Nehemiah came, they rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem. There was an attempt to reconstruct kind of the purity, the isolation, the exclusivity of the Jewish community, which had really been threatened in some ways by the exile, although in the exile they began to develop such institutions as the synagogue. They began to write down the works that would later become what we call the Old Testament as a different center that would later be very important. But at this time, the reconstitution of this chosen people who distinguished themselves from the other people around was very important. There was opposition to that, certainly, because during the exile, other people had come into the area, had started their living there, had planted crops there, and established a life there, and they too were exiled and their property taken to a large extent. But there was also opposition from within the Jewish community. It began really in the exile with the later parts of the book of Isaiah saying that it was too light a thing that the people, that the prophet, that the word would be given to only the people of Israel. That those people and that prophecy and that word were meant to be a light to the nations, as they said, the Gentiles, the Goyim. And Ruth came to be written at the time of the return, when the exclusivity was being reinstituted. Ruth is a protest against the book and the attitudes of books and attitudes of Ezra and Nehemiah and this whole enterprise. Exclusivity, chosenness, isolation, and what amounted to racial purity, ethnic cleansing. Ruth says to that attitude, look at Ruth. She is the great-grandmother of David the king, the ideal. The forerunner of the Messiah, called the Son of God in some places. And she is a foreign wife. She was a Moabite. So what's that about? It says. Part of the wonderful discussion and oppositions that you can find in the Hebrew Scriptures that aren't as edited and purified as the New Testament is, with books being banned and burned. These were kept and incorporated in the library of the Hebrew Scripture. But this opposition in understanding really what is the foundation of the identity of the chosen people, God's chosen people, continued. And it surfaced at the time of Jesus in quite a strong way. The walls that Nehemiah built didn't last. They came tumbling down with Alexander the Great and the Romans after him. And there were lots of foreign people in and out of Jerusalem with that tension of an assertion of purity versus an assertion of incorporation and inclusion continuing. The Pharisees, who were the pure, I think that the word Pharisee might mean pure, chose the direction of purity, and they interpreted the writings, the Torah, to be a minute law governing behavior in such ways that through marriage laws and dietary laws, and what you could wear, what work you could do, all were designed to put a sacred wall, a spiritual wall around the people, and to exclude those who would not conform and include those who were true descendants of Jacob. This was the atmosphere that Jesus was raised in, and he felt more of an affinity for the Pharisees than he did the co-opted priestly caste of the Sadducees. But in spite of himself, sometimes it seems he couldn't stay there. To the Samaritan woman asks to be healed, and he says that rather startling phrase, you don't give the children's food to the dogs. But she calmly says back, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the food that has fallen from the master's plate. This Roman centurion comes to him and says, I am not worthy for you to come under my roof as a Gentile. It's parenthetically assumed, but speak the word only, and my servant will be healed. And Jesus sees his faith, and you get a growing understanding that Jesus is not in the tradition of exclusion, but in the tradition of inclusion from 2nd Isaiah and from Ruth. And that tension continued in the church. Not all of the early Christians were inclusive. Jesus' brother James continued the Jerusalem community, and they remained ethnically, racially identified as Jews. They went to the temple regularly and saw themselves within that exclusive community. But there were others that went in different directions. St. Paul, and there was the earliest, greatest argument was who could be included. Could Gentiles be a part of the church, part of this people of God, this continuing group of chosen people? Could people who were not circumcised be included? And the church, as it evolved, said yes, they could. And it appealed to many. And then In 70 AD, there was the destruction of the Jerusalem by the Romans that caused a great upheaval in the life of Christians, Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians, all, and the heirs of the Pharisees in the continuing rabbinic strain of Judaism developed ways to maintain a sense of purity and exclusivity, even though living in dispersion. And they, at that point, exiled, dispelled the Christians from the synagogue, not only because of their theological assertion of the identity of Jesus, the Word, and God the Father, which had not really developed yet at that point, but more even in the fact that Christians were opening the revelation to the Gentiles and including them. So this has been a matter of tension for a long time, and where the rabbinic process probably ensured the continuation of a Jewish people in the many threatening environments of the last 2,000 years. The Christian idea of inclusivity and mission allowed the Christian interpretation to spread far and wide. First to other outcasts who didn't have any place to be, but then to the wealthy, the powerful, eventually becoming a part of the way of life of Europe and beyond. The issue of exclusivity and inclusivity, of diversity versus purity, are really archetypal issues, not only in historical example, but they're parts of life that we struggle with as well. The sense of the other as somehow threatening pollution of what we hold to be dear, or contrarily, the other as providing variety that is, as they say, the spice of life. That tension, especially the sense of the needing exclusivity, especially in Europe, gave rise to a nationalism, to ethnic hatreds that inevitably ended in war, and we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the end of what was called the Great War, that had Germans and French and Ottomans and English fighting each other in those terrible trenches for years and years, and then Americans eventually becoming involved, all seeing God as on their side as they slaughtered each other by the millions. How the idea of otherness, of nationalism, of ethnic pride and tradition are worked out is often a political issue, and the church has manifested itself in a huge variety of political environments, in the Roman Empire, in feudalism in the Middle Ages, in the underneath the monarchs with divine rights of kings, and in democracies and other places. And our stance is not political. Politics has to do with how one works out the the living out of one's values. But our stance is foundational and ultimate in the sense that it is inclusive of all people, not recognizing even the existence of such a thing as race, really, realizing that boundaries and barriers and borders are artificial implantations. We are one people. We all come from God. Each person is equal in spirit, whatever their country, whatever their race, whatever their supposed race, whatever their religion, even their creed. We are a part of a unified creation. We have one God and one people. We say we believe in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and we believe the church has a kind of holiness about it. We trace it to the apostles, but its Catholicity has nothing to do with Roman Catholic doctrine. It has to do with the sense of universality, that the love, the salvation, the spirit of Jesus is meant for everyone. And we are part of that body, that one body. And that is a challenge. It's a challenge when we face threats. It's a challenge when we encounter conflict and disagreement. But our tendencies toward purification, maintenance of purification, and exclusivity are all driven by fear. The fear was with Nehemiah and Ezra, fear of the loss of what they had, fear of being overrun, fear of not being a people anymore. And fear, the world is a scary place. And that fear causes us to pull back from the other, whoever the other may be. And we as Christians are not afraid. We are freed from fear, ultimately. We need to be intelligent and cautious and wary, perhaps, in establishing the process through which we share our love, but sharing our love and loving others is not an option. We are called to love our neighbor, we are called to love our family, we are called to love our friends, we are called to love our enemies. And that is our mission. And that may or may not change the world, but it is what God is doing through us in the world now. We carry on this tradition that we gained from the past, that we gained from Isaiah and Ruth and Jesus and Paul. And when we encounter conflict, when we encounter hatred, when we encounter fear, when we encounter confusion and hostility, we need to bring to that our faith and our love and our hope that has been saving grace for us. That's what the presiding bishop means by calling us to be a Jesus people, a Jesus movement. And in that, we leave the ultimate answers to God as we work to bring love and joy, and as it was said 100 years ago, peace in our time. Thanks be to God.